Welcome, everybody. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College, and welcome to the virtual reading group. We are continuing to read this posthumous collection of Hannah Arendt's The Jewish Writings. We are, nearing the end of this section of her writings in the 1940s, which has been the bulk of the book in many ways. And as we've been talking about the last few weeks, these writings are very much about her attempt to come to grips with the idea of Zionism. She has a mixed history on Zionism. She worked for Zionist organizations when she was in Germany and then in France. As we read last week in her, well-known and controversial essay, Zionism Reconsidered, she turns against Zionism in the mid to late 1940s, insofar as she sees Zionism as being taken over by a kind of revisionist Zionism, which she says no longer aims simply at what she calls a Jewish homeland, but aims at a Jewish state. And she's always thought of this as the more radical version of Zionism, a version of Zionism that for her was always one of many opinions amongst Jews and even amongst Zionists, right? I mean, this is an important point that we will get to in the essays we read for today, and also was in Zionism Reconsidered, that for her, certain Jewish leadership came to associate Zionism with the claim of a Jewish state, but that was certainly not the opinion of all Jews and all Zionists for long periods of time in the 1930s and 40s. And Arendt has been in this period fighting what will turn out to be a losing battle, right? A battle within the Zionist movement for the soul of Zionism. And in the last essay that we read for last week, Zionism Reconsidered from 1944, she realizes she's lost, right? I mean, she begins that essay, saying the end of 50 years of Zionist politics happens in 1944 in the Atlantic City World Zionist Congress, in which the Congress adopts the revisionist program that we need to have a free and democratic Jewish commonwealth that will embrace the whole of Palestine, undivided and undiminished. That embrace of what she calls the revisionist platform in 1944 sort of ends the debate internal to Zionism, and turns her against Zionism, or at least into a critic of Zionism. The two essays that we're reading for this week, The Jewish State, which is the title of Theodor Herzl's book, and it's written, I think, on the 50th anniversary, 50 years after where Herzl's politics led, and then To Save the Jewish Homeland, were both published in Commentary magazine, and republished here in this volume. The Jewish State, which is an engagement with Herzl to some degree, at least as a beginning, tries to find in Herzl and in his book an understanding of how Herzl's politics led to the present. This is 1946, I believe she's writing this particular essay. And how do we get there? So she begins saying that to read the Jewish state today is a peculiar experience, because what he thought was utopian, a state, is suddenly actually quite practical, and what he thought was practical has sort of fallen by the wayside. A kind of um relief by labor kind of things, labor Zionism, which was Arendt's real interest, has fallen by the wayside. So the first thing she really wants us to know about Herzl in her reading is that Herzl shared with many other national leaders and other leaders of this time the character of being a crackpot, technical term that she uses on 375, right? When he wrote The Jewish State, Herzl was deeply convinced that he was under some sort of higher inspiration. He's sort of channeling some forces of history or nature. And yet he was also at the time earnestly afraid of making a fool of himself, she writes. This extreme self-esteem mixed with self-doubt is, she says, a not rare phenomenon and is usually the sign of a crackpot. I think you could probably all come up with a number of crackpots that you would find that in today. People who have an incredible self-esteem and yet are constantly deeply fearful of being shown to be fools. Okay. The main thrust, though, of her analysis of Herzl and of his book, The Jewish State, comes from her understanding of Herzl's connection to anti-Semitism. And this is something we've touched on previously, but I think it's more clear here than in other essays. Herzl saw anti-Semitism as an unstoppable and probably ineradicable force of world history. So in doing so, he embraces anti-Semitism. He has a faith in anti-Semitism, Arendt writes. He comes to see anti-Semitism as a tool that can be used in Jewish politics, so that the Jews' best friends are anti-Semites, he writes, and anti-Semitic governments are their best allies. Why? Because they will, help Jews leave their countries and form their own state. So that anti-Semites are for him not someone to be fought, but someone to be used. Now, we talked about this, I think, last week and maybe in some other weeks as well, in that there's this idea that I think some Zionists had that, because the world was full of anti-Semites, Jews needed to form their own state in Israel. And to do so, they just had to retreat into Israel and hold themselves down. And Arendt has been very critical of this approach on largely practical grounds, because she thinks that if the whole world is anti-Semitic and you retreat to, one little homeland, eventually they'll come for you there. And she repeats that critique here as well. In order to understand Herzl, though, she says that he shares with other demagogic politicians, and she sees him as, without a doubt, a demagogue, a contempt for the masses, and yet an affinity with them. So who was Herzl? She says that Herzl was, in many ways, the embodiment of what were called Luftmenschen, airmen, men of the air. And these were Jewish, in this case, Jewish intellectuals, who, because they were intellectuals, could no longer be Jewish in the sense of religiously Jewish and part of the sort of shtetl or local Jewish communities. They had sort of left those communities, like when someone leaves, a small town, goes to college, and they can come back to visit, but they'll always be outsiders. And then on the one hand, they couldn't be Jewish in that sense anymore, and on the other hand, they couldn't assimilate. And so they were people who had no place, nowhere. Luftmenschen, they were airmen. And it's as a representative of these airmen that Herzl came to see the Jewish state as the answer to a place where these airmen could be at home, these Luftmenschen, and he sought to create this idea. There's one of the things that I found most fascinating about this essay was Arendt's clear-sighted reading of Herzl and Zionism as ideologies and as an ideologue. Yana, can you enable captioning? Someone's asking. She reads Herzl as an ideologue and reads Zionism as an ideology. And in the middle of 377, she writes, Herzl's conviction that he was in alliance with history and nature themselves saved him from the suspicion that he himself might have been insane. It's a fascinating phrase, because when she says that he was in alliance with history and nature, this is the same language she's going to use in The Origins of Totalitarianism to describe Nazism and Bolshevism. So that in that book, Origins, she argues that the Nazis are in alliance with nature and the Bolsheviks are in alliance with history, insofar as Bolshevism is an ideology of the forces of history through dialectical materialism, and Nazism is an ideology that is governed by the forces of nature, namely racism. And she argues that the two great thinkers of racism and historicism are Darwin and Marx. And that she says that Darwin sort of provides the intellectual justification for, the intellectual backbone for all racism, and certainly Nazi racism in this case. And Marx provides the intellectual backbone for Bolshevism. It's interesting that she's here in reading Herzl on 377, arguing that he was both in alliance with history and nature. She's reading Herzl, in a sense, as a racist. I'm just going to be very clear about that. Insofar as Herzl has some sort of vision of the Jews as a people apart, who potentially are above, but certainly apart. And secondly, as at least a Marxist, in the sense of he, or at least Zionism, Herzl Zionism, falls into a kind of historical progressivism in which the Zionist state will emerge as a need of history. And so these are, we can talk about this, but it does strike me that this is one of the early places in Arendt's work where you begin to see her thinking about ideology in this way, which is going to play such an important role in her own thinking later in The Origins of Totalitarianism. I want to take a look at on page 378 at a really interesting few paragraphs where she is talking about, she says, Jewish secularization culminated at last in a second attempt to dissolve the diaspora. And this was the rise of the Zionist movement. Okay, the first attempt, which we're not going to go into, we can talk about it if you like, was the Shabbatai Tsevi movement. I know very little bit about it. If anyone wants to later, we can talk about it. But it was a religious, mystical movement for a kind of Jewish salvation in a homeland. And now you have Zionism as the second great secular movement in this way. And she says here that to be confronted that in some ways, Zionism, even though it was secular, was not more realistic. And she puts realistic in quotes. And I'm really, and this is sort of a fascinating passage here. So on 378, she says, to be confronted by reality does not automatically produce an understanding of reality or make one feel at home in it. Right? To be confronted by reality does not lead to an understanding of reality or make one feel at home in it. Now, this is a fascinating claim because so much of Arendt's writing in the 40s and 50s is structured by the phrase that we need to confront reality. We need to face up to reality, no matter what it means. That's as she says in the preface to the Origins, that reality and the flight from reality, she calls it in many of her essays, is sort of part and parcel of ideology. But here she says, to be confronted by reality does not automatically produce an understanding of reality or make one feel at home. On the contrary, the process of secularization made Jews even less, again in quotes, realistic. What does she mean by that? Well, she adds, that is, less capable than ever before of facing and understanding the real situation. So secularism, the loss of their Jewish faith, turned the Jews away from religion back to the world, but made them less capable of understanding reality. Why? Well, she adds again, in losing their faith in a divine beginning and ultimate continuation of history, the Jews lost their guide through the wilderness of bare facts. For when man is robbed of all means of interpreting events, he is left with no sense whatsoever of reality. Bare facts are not a reality, right? This is one of those, when people talk about, the loss of truth today and defactualization, and Arendt is often brought into these debates. There's, she wrote the essays, Lying in Politics and Truth in Politics. But Arendt can't be brought in to support the idea that simple factuality is what leads us to confront reality. That's true throughout her work, but it's here, deeply here, right? So that in losing their faith, she then says they lost their guide or their key to history. You can't, she says, but she says by the 19th century, it was a need that was not at all specific to the Jews alone. In this context, Zionism can be included among the many isms or ideologies of that period, each of which claimed to explain reality and predict the future in terms of irresistible laws and forces. Yet the case of the Jews was and still remains different. What they needed was not only a guide to reality, but reality itself, not simply a key to history, but the experience itself of history. What all these ideologies do, whether it's Marxism, racism, Zionism, is give us a key or a guide to interpreting the bare facts. And that by the 19th century, when people are living in a world where they've lost reality, when they've lost their connection to a tradition or a home, when the world is breaking, the tradition is breaking. In a sense, it's almost less realistic to simply live in facts. You need an ideology, you need an ism. Now, is she saying, therefore, that now we all need ideologies? I don't think that's what she's saying, because she's clearly believes that ideologies, what they do is by providing a key to history, also hide reality by turning everything and making us see everything within the reasoning and the interpretive frame of that ideology. And that's the danger of ideology, is that it can create coherent fictional worlds. And that's the key word, I think, coherent. What ideologies do is provide coherence. What we started to experience in the 19th century, and certainly in the 20th century as a Western world, and primarily, I think, probably now beyond the Western world, but we can leave that aside for a second, is the breakdown of reality, which left the world with the pillars of the world broken, as she often poetically puts it, the break of tradition. And the Hegelian attempt to reconcile spirit and reality, mind and reality, breaks down. The loss of reconciliation, and we're confronted with a world that is chaotic and doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And it's that world, which is the real situation we confront. To reconcile ourselves to that kind of irreconcilable world, to that kind of world of being broken, is what is so difficult, and what in her later work becomes, I think, her ideal of what it means to think in our time, is to reconcile ourselves to the brokenness and irreconcilability of our world, the plurality of our world, the lack of unanimity of our world, which will bring us to the second essay. And the inability to confront that reality is what leads to the rise of ideologies like Zionism, racism, and communism or Bolshevism. Yeah, that's what else do I want to say about this essay? On 380 to 381. She has some really, interesting points about, again, about Zionism and anti-Semitism, whereas she says the Zionists saw anti-Semitism as a natural reaction of national peoples to Jews. They accepted it. They didn't think it was crazy. They saw anti-Semitism as a completely natural reaction in a world of nation states, and that the Zionists simply wanted to be a nation like everyone else, therefore to be nationalist or racist like everybody else. For her, there was a kind of good Zionism, right? The kind of Zionism she was interested in, the Zionism which would, on the one hand, oppose the hidden chauvinism of assimilation, the idea that assimilated Jews had, that even though they were no longer religiously Jewish, they were still special or better than other people, and would oppose the utopianism of radical Zionists, who thought that it would lead to a kind of eventual idea of justice, and that there was a kind of Zionism that could lead to a middle road, a kind of the Jewish homeland, as she often calls it. But she doesn't think that this Zionism has won. Okay, for the second essay, to save the Jewish homeland, this is written right after the UN partition of Palestine in 1947, and published in commentary early in 1948. The first part of it, and much of it is some of her repeated critiques of revisionist Zionism, the fact that both the Jews and the Arabs refused compromise, the idea that they depended upon outside powers. And there's a kind of sense of hopelessness that pervades this essay. Whereas I think, in 1948, many Jews around the world, as she says, have become homogenous or unanimous in their view that it's victory or death. She sees a kind of hopelessness emerging. And since I've already talked for a bit, I'm going to just quickly skip to the end of the essay, which is what I really wanted to talk about on page 400, where she offers her account of the three different possibilities that were available to the new partitioned area of Palestine. So one was partition itself, right? Actually, let me start with the last one. She talks about trusteeship. I mean, this was the original idea that Britain or the United States would act as a trusteeship for the land, which would house both Arabs and Jews. Largely at the behest of Jews and the Zionists, the UN instead passed partition, and the idea of partition, as she says, was simply and always had been wishful thinking. The partition of so small a country, she says, could at best mean the petrification of the conflict, that they would sort of both grow angrier and angrier at each other, which would result in arrested development for both peoples, and at its worst would signify a temporary stage during which both parties would prepare for future war. I think this is one of those cases where she's been proven quite right along those lines. So if one opportunity was trusteeship, another was partition, the third, and the one that she has most come to be identified with, was in her mind the most realistic, which seems strange today, but it was her view, is federation. And so she says the alternative proposition of a federated state, which was endorsed by Dr. Magnus, is much more realistic, despite the fact that it establishes a common government for two different peoples. It avoids the troublesome majority-minority constellation, which is insoluble by definition, right? So the problem with partition and the problem with statehood, which we've talked about a lot, and so I don't want to repeat it too much, is again, that any state is going to have a majority and a minority. It's always going to have first and second class citizens. It's always going to have the problem of the nation conquering the state, and the minority peoples being either discriminated against, expelled, or killed. A federated structure, as she describes it, and here she gives a little bit more detail. A federated structure would have to rest on Jewish Arab community councils, which would mean that the Jewish-Arab conflict would be resolved on the lowest and most promising level of proximity and neighborliness. So again, her point here is that for a federation, you have an overarching state idea, but you then have small local councils and small local federations where people govern themselves. And most of the governance is not done by the state, but by these local councils. And she thinks that this is the best chance for people who truly disagree to govern themselves, because they can actually talk to each other in councils, disagree with each other, and compromise. It's in these local self-government and mixed Jewish, Arab, municipal, and rural councils, as she says at the last paragraph of the whole essay, on a small scale and as numerous as possible. Having as many and as small of these councils as possible, she says, was the only realistic political measure that could eventually lead to the political emancipation of Palestine. So this is, I think, as close as she gets, as far as I know, in her writing, to articulating her vision of federalism and a federated a federated state, at least in this context. Overarching state with as many and as small micro councils comprised of both Jews and Arabs together, governing themselves on a local level. Okay, that's, to her mind, the only way to save the Jewish homeland. Obviously, it hasn't happened, didn't happen. And today it might be even more folly to think that it could happen. But that was her idea back then. All right. Is the chat activated? Or not? Yes, it looks like it is. Please be respectful in the chat. Happy to have you guys talk and think in it. Just be respectful to each other. For those who want to participate in the online and in our conversation, you can raise your hand, go into the reactions button at the bottom and hit raise hand. And I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you all very much. Ken.
Oh, I hate to go before Jerome, but I'm going to anyway. I just wanted to talk a little bit more about the Jewish homeland, more subjectively than you're addressing it right now, because to me, that's kind of key to the whole book, which is not about Israel as a place, but kind of really the humanity and the freedom of Jews to live in the world. And I think that's what, when she's talking about homeland, I don't think she would say that Israel failed as a homeland or that it became purely a state, but that it does a little of both. And the distinction I think she's making here when she's calling it a homeland versus a state has to do with how we can live in Israel as Jews. Like, I'm thinking of it even as in my own road. I live on a little dirt road. And when my neighbors feel hostile, it's very hard to feel like I'm coming home. I'm involved in this sort of like battle here. And I think when she's talking about the state and what's at stake here, it's about living peacefully there so they can be creative people. If they're spending 24/7 fighting, as she says, then they can't be, there's no freedom there. For her idea of freedom, equality is really important. So there has to be some sort of Arab and Jewish relationships that allow Jews to make, follow the kibbutz movement and do all the creative and beautiful things they've done in Israel. And I think it's a day-to-day thing, the way that we would have to look at Israel and how her interpretation of how the state was being established, how successful or how unsuccessful it is. But it seems like it has a lot to do with equality, at least the neighbors accepting each other, not necessarily liking each other, but realizing that they're trying to make a beautiful place in this desert and figure out who their friends and foes are so that they can live productively. Anyway.
Thanks, Ken. So, I think what you said about a homeland, is right. I'm not entirely sure I understood your comments on the state. I think for her, the idea of a Jewish state is a nation state, right? Let's just be very clear about that. It's a state in which there's a national people, the Jews, who are, the people who created the state and the people in control of the state. Just like Germany is a state of Germans, and Czech is a state of the Czechs, and Russia is a state of the Russians, or India is a state of the Hindus. And for her, all nation states are not only problematic insofar as the nation will inevitably, in her mind, almost inevitably, it has been, and she thinks it's almost inevitable, conquer the state being the kind of equality that you're talking about. And so she simply doesn't think that nation states can survive in a just way. And more than that, she thinks that the 20th century has shown that nation states simply are unstable and will always lead to oppressions, expulsions, forced assimilation, forced expulsions, or exterminations. And she thinks the nation state system is a broken system that we need to replace in some way. How to replace it is a complicated question, and she doesn't have all the answers, right? But she certainly is confident in her analysis of the weakness of the nation state. And the two examples that come up in her writing to replace the nation state are the United States, which she considers, at least at some points in its history, a non-national state, and a republican, a constitutional republic, and also a federal constitutional republic, or this kind of more explicit federated systems. And so, to the extent that she distinguishes a Jewish homeland from a Jewish state, she's adamant that the Jews need a homeland. They need a place where they can thrive as Jews and not have to constantly worrying about assimilating into a nation state structure, or confront the kind of unequal status that they have throughout other places. And yet she's also adamant that if Zionism turns away from a Jewish homeland to a Jewish state, it will not only be racist and unjust, she thinks it will fail, just like nation states fail, because it will have to either become a nation and expel people, or become a state and lose its national characteristic. She doesn't see how you can avoid that conflict. So I'm not sure if that, maybe I misunderstood your question, but that's, just.
No, I was just saying the state is almost a fact. It's the place. And
But she doesn't think, just so she doesn't think that's the case. She thinks that in the United States, at least in in a certain period, she thinks that there was a state that was not a nation state, that there was no national people. And that anyone could come to the United States and be a Jew and be American, and not have that be a conflict, or be a German and American, or Polish American. The one, I've mentioned this many times, but the one question is, can you come to the United States and be a Black and an American at the same time? And that's, I think the largest threat to her idea of America as not a nation state. But that was her hope and idea, and her experience as a Jew of America is that the only place she'd ever been where she could be both a Jew and an American, right? And thus she saw it as a state. But she didn't know of any others. And maybe there are some, but she doesn't think of the state as a place free from the nation when there's a national people, like in Israel or in Germany, or, people could argue today that Germany has become more of a state and less of a nation state. And I think there's a good argument for that, but we'd have to get into. Okay. Jerry, how are you?
Fine, thank you. Roger, can you hear me?
I can.
Oh, good. Roger, I wanted to ask you if you thought it was worthwhile talking about what I see as a beautiful and remarkable symmetry in when Hannah talks about a Jewish homeland in Palestine. That is to say, a Palestinian, I don't know if you want to call it a state, I would call it a polis. Frankly, it is where people have their own different people, diverse, plurality of peoples have their public space. And there is a place in this book where she goes on and on about how such a polity in the Middle East has a tremendous potential, by which she means power, tremendous potential. But what the symmetry I'm talking about is, since the Jews were the principal, not the only, but the principal victims of the, one might say, ultimate nation state of Nazi Germany, with the Aryan race, the Jews she should see the opposite of that, the very opposite, the opportunity for Jews who were killed by the ultimate nation state, that they were then the foundation of what she sees as the answer to totalitarianism, a new kind of state that has its roots maybe in the ancient polis, but it is nevertheless a polity. To me, that is what is most, when I did this book, it was the most striking theme in the whole book. But I don't know if you think that's worth considering or not.
Thank you, Jerry. First of all, the first part of your question, I think, is fascinating, because she does talk in the second essay, right, that we read for today. I believe it was the second one, about the threat of unanimity. And she doesn't really, what you did, which I thought was really wonderful, is sort of say, well, isn't Palestine, whatever we're going to call it, like a nirvana of plurality? Isn't it like, you have all these different people, you have Druids, Jews, Arabs, etc. I take that to be your point. And isn't there something wonderful about that, to try and create a politics there? I mean, Arendt, not that I'm aware of, doesn't ever sort of put it in those terms. I mean, I think she's much more, she's worried about it. But I think what you're right about is, in many ways, it is a locus classicus for what she thinks of politics as, of plurality. A wide group of people who disagree, who somehow have to come together and form a polity. And it is a challenge in that way. And what she sees happening is that neither the Jews nor the Arabs are up to the challenge, insofar as the Jews want to kick the Arabs out and the Arabs want to kick the Jews out, or at least create an Arab state, and the Jews want to create a Jewish state. The second part of your question, Jerry, I hope you're still on. I think you're still on. Yeah, you're there. Is about, the symmetry you're talking about. She does have this really not strange, but unique language on 395, where she's talking about the Kibbutzim. And she says about the Kibbutzim, on the one hand, she's critical of them, right? In that they abstain from politics. But she also says that in this complete freedom and unhampered by any government, a new form of ownership, a new type of farmer, a new way of family life and child education, and new approaches to the troublesome conflicts between city and country, between rural and industrial labor, have been created. And then she talks later about how this created a new type of man. And so there is this kind of symmetry, I think, in which the sort of flight from Nazi Germany and Europe and anti-Semitism to a kind of almost, in her mind, naive, non-political life on the kibbutz. People who become too absorbed in their quiet and effective revolution to even participate in Zionist politics, she says, and that's her critique of them. But in that freedom from government, they were able to create new institutions that could be the basis of kind of a local government or local federated rule. And I think that's the sort of utopian, I don't know if utopian is the right word, Jerry. I don't know if you think of it in that way or not, but that's sort of the basis of what I consider to be her hopeful thought about federation, that these local institutions that come from a kind of freedom from government, with new families, new child rearing, new approaches to conflicts between rural and industrial labor, that these could be created, and this could be the foundation for a new politics. Is that what you have in mind, or does that make sense to you, Jerry?
Well, Roger, I was thinking more of what Arendt says perhaps more distinctly elsewhere, about the council state, the council form of government. I think it's well known that Jews and Arabs in Palestine, on a lower level than the hierarchical level, that is to say, when the power in the council state is on the bottom level, not on the top level, that they get along very well together, very, very well. They're Semitic people. That's why the Nazis had such a terrible time in Africa, in North Africa, with when they tried to enlist Arabs in their movement. They had to stop using anti-Semitism. I think what is not considered yet in Arendt, so far, with very few exceptions, is the notion of this council state. That is the opposite of the totalitarianism. That is her answer to it. And the fact that she saw it possible here in Palestine, that's the real point I wanted to make. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I guess what I was trying to suggest is that I think that her reading of the kibbutz and the kibbutzim and the kibbutz movement is connected with her understanding of the councils and the local government, because they're both development of local institutions, free from the larger politics, that allows for new kind of ways of collective living to emerge. And one of her great fears, as she says here, is that the rise of a Jewish state will destroy the kibbutzim, which of course happened. So I think there's an important connection between the councils and the kibbutzim. In Hungary, you had the councils, right? During the Hungarian Revolution, you had the workers' councils, and in other places. I think what was fascinating for her was this idea that you had both the kibbutzim movement that could be brought into and play towards the councils, but it didn't happen here. And that would have been, I think, for her, a fascinating movement. So thank you. Miriam, you're up next. Miriam, you're muted, so you have to unmute yourself.
Sorry. Question for you or anybody who wants to answer. I'm just, is there any place where she elaborates at all on relationships between small councils? Like, how do you build a federation? If there's an overarching government, say for things like infrastructure, large issues, and then there's all these councils. How do you, does she talk anywhere about how that is supposed to work? Like, especially if the councils, let's say, are not friendly to each other, if they have disagreements from, say, one neighborhood to the next. How is there anything about that, or does anybody want to speculate how she might have answered that question? Is it like a pyramid, the councils on the bottom, little councils, and then they gradually build up higher to the central, more centralized government? And then how do you mount the levels?
Yeah, thank you, Miriam. So, first of all, she never fully, she doesn't come up with a theory of council government per se. That said, she does talk about it in a number of different places in a number of different ways. And one thing she does talk about is exactly like what you just said, which is like the reverse, the pyramid. So she's like, you have all these different councils, and each council elects or chooses a leader, partly just not even officially sometimes, but because there's always someone emerges who takes a leadership role. And then they go up to another level. And then there's another councils, and there's a leader emerges, and they go up. And, what she says at the end of On Revolution, Miriam, is that, hello?
Yeah, I'm just writing it down.
Yeah.
Oh,
What she says at the end of On Revolution is that you need, that there's been no country and no state, no people in the history of the world where most people want to engage in politics, right? Most people don't. Most people want to eat, have sex, watch TV, listen to TikTok or whatever it's called, and do all that stuff, right? Most people don't. And so she says, you're always going to need a political elite. The difference, though, is the political elite has to come from the bottom up, not the top down. It can't be a political elite based on income, oligarchy, based on race, racism, or aristocracy based on, your genes or your parents or whatever. It has to come from the people who want to participate and do it well from the bottom up. So she says you can't be afraid of elitism. You just have to have the right kind of elitism, not the wrong kind of elitism. And so that's one way that she does think about councils. I mean, there's others as well. She talks about the French debating societies during before the French Revolution, and the idea that they didn't have any purpose, but by bringing people together to debate and talk who disagree, sometimes they would just yell at each other. Sometimes there wouldn't be much debate and they'd go home. But every once in a while, they would come upon an issue and they try and solve it, and it would lead to a political solution. And so she's simply having institutions that bring people together to talk on a local level is important. And so this leads to her discussion of the ward system, which Thomas Jefferson had suggested was the greatest lack of the U.S. Constitution, was that it failed to provide institutional spaces for people to gather, talk, and debate outside of the United States Congress. And so it didn't provide a local foundation, institutional foundation for federated democracy. And so these different comments she makes in different places, and there's probably some more, I think, and this essay, To Save the Jewish Homeland, is one of the more detailed, where she talks both about the Kibbutzim and about local councils and local self-government and mixed Jewish, Arab, municipal, and rural councils, right? Gives you, I think you can start to build a sense of a constitutional state that provides local institutional foundations for small groups of mixed peoples to congregate, discuss, and talk about self-government that would then level up to leaders coming up. And I think that's at least, some of the hints that she gives of what she would imagine a federated system would entail. She does say things like, this is sort of a natural, in every people in the history, there've always been these local things. And yet somehow we can't seem to create a federal government like this today. What that means is unclear. I mean, that's why I sort of hesitated when I said utopian or not. I mean, I don't think she thinks of herself as utopian. She says this is the most realistic, way to solve this problem. She thinks of it as a realist idea. But clearly it hasn't yet realized itself. So I don't know if anyone else wants to add anything to what I've said. Miriam, is asking other parts of her analysis of a federated system that anyone else wants to bring out. All right.
Roger.
Yeah.
Roger. Some years ago at TED in Vancouver, there was a moment when someone from the stage said something that in retrospect I found extremely moving, but then now I'm understanding it's problematic. And maybe even someone in the chat said it above. They said, unlike our neighbors to the south, the United States, we don't claim to be a melting pot. We excel here in cooperation and coexistence. I'd be curious to know what people think. Is Canada right, or at least people patting themselves on the back, that they have a system that is facing this reality or trying this so I think I'm not off the mark here about what a federation is and how there still is room for great diversity and so on. What do you think about what that person was saying from the stage about Canada not trying to be a melting pot, but in fact being, what was the word they used? We live together side by side and we get on well.
Yeah. I think it's a nice idea. I mean, I think it's a mistake to think of the United States as a melting pot. I think Arendt would think of it as a mistake to think of it as a melting pot as well. Although it's certainly been a metaphor that's been used. They've also had these mosaics and other things that people have brought out. But yeah, I think living together amidst our plurality and trying to find what our common interests are, is what I think Arendtian politics is about. What that means, if I understand it correctly, is that politics, at least on a national level, will be much more humble than our current politics is. Because it's unlikely that we, as a country of probably 300 or 400 languages, or if not more, and how many religions and how many races and how many whatever, are going to come to some sort of a agreement on how we should live, how we should educate, how we should work, what days our stores should be open, how many people we should marry, all these things. And if that's the case, we may need to allow much more plurality and variety in the way people live on a federal level, or on a local level. And what you have right now is pretty much both parties, or both major parties in the United States, thinking that they have the right way to live and they should impose it on others who don't agree with them. And you sort of go back and forth. I think that's very much at odds with an Arendtian vision of politics. I don't know how. I just don't know enough about Canada, Bill, so I can't really answer that, how it works in Canada. I know Canada is also a federal system. I know there's a fair bit of openness. So in Quebec, they live quite differently from in British Columbia. But I don't know enough about it to say much more than that.
Right.
Okay. Gilbert.
Yes, thank you. Let me start by saying this. Without Zionist movement, Israel would not be there. For me, all those who formed Zionism movement deserve a great gift. Let us all think about thinking. Therefore, why is the promised land, which is Israel, is so important to Jewish people? Let me describe it according to what the Holy Bible always tells us. After God saved the Jewish people from slavery in Egypt, God, he made a serious covenant with Abraham. And the same God repeatedly promised to give the land to the Jewish people. Finally, according to the Holy Bible, God gave the Israel or the promised land to the Jewish people as it was a days to hold if only they had the courage or strength to remove it from the Canaanites or to keep it safe from the enemies. Thank you.
Thank you, Gilbert. Thank you. I think, you ask a question, why is the promised land or Palestine or Israel so important to the Jews? And you gave, I think, one very important answer, which is the theocratic or religious answer. And undoubtedly, there are many Jews who agree with that. Arendt's argument here is that the Jews who actually succeeded in creating the state of Israel, that wasn't their reason, right? She thinks they were largely non-religious intellectuals who became Zionists not out of theocratic reasons, not out of theocratic reasons, but because they were what she calls Luftmenschen and needed a place to be, and also because they wanted to be normal like everybody else, and everybody else had a nation state and they wanted their own nation state and they couldn't figure out where to put one except, and here's where your explanation comes in, there's biblical and historical grounds for going back to the promised land. So there is, I think you're right, and it's important that we not forget the theocratic and also historical grounds for Zionism in Israel. I mean, there were also ideas for Zionism in Mozambique and other places for creating a state, but though it did largely take ground in the promised land, and I think partially for those theocratic reasons you brought out, but she doesn't think that's the reason it succeeded. She thinks it succeeded for for other more modern and secular reasons that we've been talking about. Okay. James.
This book has given rise to so many ideas and thinkings and feelings about what's happening 80 years ago as she's writing this and what's happening now. And I got caught by the short hairs on page 387 when she says, I do not know or want to know What would happen to Jews all over the world and to Jewish history in the future should we meet with a catastrophe in Palestine? We've been discussing a lot in terms of anti-Semitism, how our enemies give us our identity, right? And at this point, I feel as though America is experiencing an intense birthing pains of a multi-ethnic democracy after hundreds of years of culturally sanctioned racism and sexism. And to this natality, we add an explosion of gun ownership mixed with tutelage of warring video games, flamed and fanned by the social media and internet's 24/7 relentless always onness. We cannot wonder about the rise of hate, but we must also bear witness to miracles of hope and love. Does this make sense? Within days of that January 6th assault on the Capitol, we witnessed the election of a Jew and a Black man to the Senate in Georgia. Warnock's acceptance speech brings me to tears every time I hear it. What an amazing time we're in. The question was raised, what ideologies are providing us coherence to go from bare facts to reality? Any thoughts on that?
That's a great question. James,
What ideologies? Okay.
So, I mean, a couple things, right? I'll get to your question, right? First of all, great question. Secondly, Arendt was really worried that Israel would disappear. I mean, she, as much as she was right about the challenges and whatever, she was wrong in that she thought that there was almost no chance that Israel would continue to exist. And she thought the catastrophe was going to happen and that the loss of Israel would be a true catastrophe for the Jews after the Holocaust and one they might not recover from. She was wrong about that for a whole host of reasons. Just a note, I happen to agree with you about Warnock's speech. I've sent it to a bunch of people over the last week. I thought it was spectacular. So if you haven't listened to it, you should go watch it. The beautiful part of your question, or the really biting part of your question, goes back to those pages I was talking about earlier about the need for a coherent, or the not the need for, but the reality of ideologies as necessary in the modern era to organize bare facts. And you asked this question, what coherent ideology, can do that today? Arendt's answer is we have to avoid it, right? We have to avoid coherent ideologies. We have to reconcile ourselves to the fact that we live at a time in which the world is not fully coherent, and that we live in a time of both really, in the way you talked about it, the birth pains of a multi-ethnic country, but even a multi-ethnic globalized world. How do you build that? Well, if you embrace some sort of coherent ideology for that, you end up with totalitarianism. So she wants us to avoid that. And yet, without some sort of ideology, right, we are left with bare facts and no reality and no coherent, no meaningful life. So what do? I mean, what I've what I think you do, and what I've been trying to say for, is you do what you build from the bottom up, and you let an ideology emerge in this Jewish Arab council, and you let an ideology emerge in this Jewish council, and you let an ideology emerge in this Arab council, and you let local ideologies emerge. Look, this is going to be the hard part, the hard pill to swallow here. You let some people be hateful, right?
Yep.
Any local, meaningful, local area, local government, local town, local council, local college, local art institution is going to be prejudiced, is going to have its reality and its idea versus others. The point is not to get rid of anger and prejudice. The point is not to get rid of it because you can't. That's human. It's to prevent it from becoming too powerful. And how do you do that?
I think the only way is to talk to each other about it.
Okay, fine, but also to create multiple ones.
Yep.
So that no one can become too powerful. Right? You know, as Tocqueville said, freedom, the spirit of freedom comes out of the townships, the local governments. And he says, yet that spirit of freedom of the townships is often going to be boorish, prejudiced, and discriminatory. And if you're going to preserve freedom, you got to preserve boorishness and discriminatoriness. But what you can do is create enough of them that you don't let one dominate the others. And you have to, therefore, allow multiple ways of life, multiple ideologies, multiple interpretive worlds to emerge, but resist the temptation to create one overarching, coherent one.
That's what Warnock was saying in his speech.
I think that's right, actually. And I think that I think there's something really meaningful about that. But, you know, it means that a lot of our moral certainties, whether we're, you know, whatever, you know, are going to have to be said, look, I'm morally certain about this, but I understand that people in this state might have a different view, or this area might have a different view. But then there's the question of, okay, where do we say we can't compromise? What are the constitutional limits, right? You know, where do we say, look, I understand you're different than me, but look, we can't live in the same country and disagree about this. And those are the hard questions. And that's where we have to have those discussions. But, you know, the problem is when one side says this is a place I can't compromise, but we're not a majority, what do? You know, you can't impose. Do you impose your moral certainty on other people because you believe it's morally certain? And that's the kind of questions that Arendt's federalism, I think, forces us to confront.
Roger, for a comical relief, what's the name of, is Shabeti Tzvei?
Does anyone know? I don't know. Shabbatai Tsevi. I don't know this movement very well. Does anyone know this movement well?
Was he the original?
Yes.
Was he the original Q?
No. Who knows?
Shabbatai Tzvi is the preacher, the Jewish rabbi who became really important in the Ottoman Empire and argued that the Jews that he was the Messiah and that Jews should follow him to a Jewish homeland. And actually, he was taken by the Ottoman government, captured and forced to, they told him that he would either have to convert to Islam or they would kill him, and he converted to Islam. And many Jews in response also converted to Islam. And those are the kind of, they're called Dönmez today, and they live in Salonika and in Istanbul. There are still descendants of that community.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
You're
Yes,
welcome.
Thank you, Karen.
Joseph Frank did this a couple of centuries later in Poland, in that area. So he was another one, false messiah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Yeah. So she compares the Shabbatai Tzvei movement to the Zionist movement, as the Zionist movement as a secular version of that. And she says that if it fails as well, it would be a catastrophe. That was the beginning of this question. Okay. John.
Roger, on page 386, 387. This is just an observation, and there is a question embroiled in this, but and I'm trying to decipher my question, how to even state the question. But be that as it may, in the middle of page 386, she writes something that I found astounding on, and how she speaks of another experience of great importance to the future of Jewish politics was gained from the realization not that 6 million Jews had been killed, but they had been driven to death helplessly like cattle. And she goes on to this, into the paragraph that follows it and that completes that paragraph. Survival at any, the Jewish people for gone probably forever is the chief reason the Jewish people for centuries survival at any price. Instead, we find something essentially new among Jews, the desire to die for dignity, the desire for dignity at any price. It is so Masada-like in my mind that the choice of where Israel has put itself, and Israel at the moment is the greatest danger to Israel is Israel. And somewhere along the line, are we witnessing a clash of theocracy with the with the scientific man, the scientific revolution, where the two become incompatible, and that that unless we find a way to bridge this gap, are humans always going to be geared to the idea that there has to be another, and I have to destroy the other, or the other is going to destroy me? And I think this is, in my mind, it's all mixed up. It's all, they seem to combine the thoughts combine. And maybe you can help me unravel some of that if there is something to unravel.
Thanks, John. Yeah, no, I think, the lines you quoted were striking when I read them. She thinks that there's been something inherent in Judaism for a long time about life and the value of life. And that she thinks that the indignity of the Jewish lack of resistance to the Nazis, as I think she would put it, has led to a new embrace of the fighting spirit in Judaism, and that now Jews see it as essential to fight and not be. I mean, you see this in Jewish culture as well, right? If there's an anti-Semitic remark or an anti-Semitic act, you have to respond, right? And you have to respond forcefully, and I think she's arguing that that's a reaction. And by the way, I think she agrees with that, right? She always was, as she says, she was taught when she was young, if the teacher said something anti-Semitic, she'd get up, go home, and let her mother fight it out. And if you're attacked as a Jew, you defend yourself as a Jew. Her arguments for a Jewish army are all part of this.
But the Jews have survived because it didn't have a state, because it was really in the diaspora. The Jewish people is, and what keeps coming to my mind is that that is at risk today because of the state, the survival of the Jewish people. And is the survival of the Jewish people that important? And being a Jew and being active and having been active within the Jewish community, I asked myself, yeah, okay, is man ready to move on? Is this the evolution that from the world of theocracy to the world of the scientific man, or where is there a clash here?
Look, those are great questions. What does it mean to say, will Judaism survive? Do you mean Orthodox Judaism, conservative Judaism, Reform Judaism, Mishrahi Judaism? At this point, there's so many different kinds. And some, people want to insist that they're all equal, and some people want to insist that there's only one. What I will say is, what I think is clear is that to forcefully exterminate any people, religion, race, gender, whatever, is ashanda and is a violation of the basic law of human plurality. But it's really up to the people who are Jews, however they identify as Jews, to decide whether remaining Jewish and however they understand it is a meaningful act in the modern world. And that's really up to them. If people believe it's meaningful, then it's meaningful. If they stop believing it's meaningful, then it will disappear. I don't think it's something we can impose on anyone else.
Well, I just don't misunderstand. I don't want to be misunderstood, and I'm not suggesting in any sense that the willful destruction of any group is acceptable. It's not. What I'm really referring to in my own mind is I've seen from my experience and history, Jewish people have survived because they haven't had a state, and now they have a state, and they're locked into isms, and that only becomes that has become a risk for its survival. It seems counterintuitive, maybe it's contradictory, but I think the survival of the Jewish state is at its greatest risk right now, or the Jewish people, because it has a state.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't know. Obviously, a lot of people thought that Jews in America would disappear because they would assimilate. It hasn't happened yet. People thought that Israel would be the place where Jews could exist because they could just be Jews. And, and that would save the Jews, but it would also maybe allow Jews to not become as Jewish as they had to be. They wouldn't have to be separate as they had it in the diaspora. Maybe this is the point you're making, because in the diaspora, because the Jews had to be separate, they sort of, entered and became sort of part of their little ghettos, and they lived apart, and they kept themselves, apart as a Jewish people. Whereas in the state of Israel, they're just everyday people. You don't have to do anything to prove you're Jewish. But I'm not sure I understand where why the state of Israel is a danger to Judaism, unless you think that it's going to be destroyed, which I guess is possible. But
well, I see we've had great states throughout history, the Assyrians, the Ottoman Empire, etc. All these powers, and they've always needed arms to survive, and essentially they don't survive. They haven't survived. They've passed through the pages of history. And the Jewish people's craving for the very same type of state is, in my mind, a great danger to the survival of the Jewish people at this point in time.
It's possible. If Jews see themselves as the essence of Judaism as being the survival of the state of Israel, you're probably right. But I think most Jews probably don't see that. I think they're in favor of the survival of the state of Israel, but I don't think they think Judaism would disappear if Israel disappeared. But I don't know.
Thank you.
Yep. We only got a couple minutes left. Let's try and keep the questions short. George, and then Hannah and Vigdis.
Okay, just
Really
quick
brief if you could. Yeah.
Just going back to Luftmensch concept, I read recently that Herzl was considered a Luftmensch because what he wanted was a Jewish homeland. He didn't specify where. That would have a German Jewish culture and would be guarded by an army of good anti-Semites, Germans, against all bad anti-Semites. That would, at least that made sense. It's sort of going to Hannah Arendt, again, when she's talking about Israel and the Greek concept of polis and et cetera, again, who is going to be the army that is going to guard that polis against all the anti-Semites in the world?
Yeah, well, she has the same question, George, and she thinks it's going to be some foreign power, and that's not going to be a good thing to rely on.
Exactly.
But as we all know, they haven't necessarily needed that.
And I think this is what got her into trouble in the United States. She idealized it, and she, got her into trouble with the Little Rock thing, and by the other thing that she sort of somehow, even though there was a lot of anti-Semites with the Jews at that time too, she had just gotten there from Europe, so she compared that.
Yeah,
that's all I wanted to say.
Thank you. Hannah, we got 1 minute left. Let's see what we can do. You got to unmute.
Yeah, I have too much to say for 1 minute. But I would say that these two essays are simply the most of all of her essays in this volume, and maybe in all of her writings, are the most political, and in terms of today, the most important when you look at what's going on today between the Zionists and the anti-Zionists. The anti-Zionists have adopted these two essays as their own for their argument against nationalism and against Israel being a nationalist, a nation, because of the majority-minority situation with the Arabs. But I just think they're the worst essays she's ever written. I think that she totally utopian. So many understatements in these essays that are deeply offensive to me. Things like well, in any event, for those of us who think, I just can't believe that she wrote these in 45 and 46, when 6 million people were murdered in ovens. And, she's just acting la-di-da, as if there weren't the most incredible realpolitik at work. I just think it's just ridiculous. And I think that it points to, I just love so much of her writing, but I really, 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 really dislike these essays profoundly for their terrible, I just feel she treated, in fact, what she's really doing is treating the survivors of this most hideous thing in history that ever happened. She's treating them flippantly. She's treating them, in a way that is not an emergency as it was. I don't know. I could go on, but it's too late. Anyway.
Well, thank you. And it's probably a good way to end. I don't want to not respond. So I'll just say
That's all right.
A couple things, right? But, I think similar reactions followed her book, Eichmann in Jerusalem,
which I don't agree with. I loved Eichmann in Jerusalem.
Written 20 years later. And the claim was that she was too distant, too intellectual, too ironic.
Right.
And didn't give voice to the victims.
But I don't agree with that.
Okay, I'm not okay.
Right.
It'd be interesting to know, what the difference is per se.
The banality of evil was simply not understood rhetorically.
Right. So here she's, if the banality of evil and if her attempt to understand Eichmann in that book is sort of what we need to really grapple with, and people who criticize it haven't, You know, the argument here would be that in these essays and in this volume as a whole, up through the 1940s, the driving force has been to understand to what extent the Zionist drive for a Jewish homeland is, in her mind, what it means to do honor to the survivors and to do honor to the needs of the moment.
I don't think she was thinking about the honor of the survivors in a way. I don't know.
Well, I mean, I think she does. She says they needed a place to go. She said it wasn't just about anything else. They needed a place where they could just be. She says,
I know, but then she, you know, she attributes to the Zionists that, you know, they're acting as the master race, just like the Nazis, except that they would choose suicide over murder. Awful.
Okay. I don't think she says just like the Nazis, but she is saying
Well, she impugns it because that's the master race where it derives from. But, you know, it's too late to deal with it. But, you know, the thing is that, you know, talk about, you use the word utopian, and it just wasn't the time for utopian. But she absolutely was right that it would be an internally conflicted situation. And certainly the word tragic applies to the conflict with both sides having legitimate claims. But, you know, I just think she was pissing against the wind.
Well, I think she agrees with you on that. You know, she comes to believe she was pissing against the wind. But she's going to piss and she's going to say what her piece is and say, look, I think it's going to be a tragic situation. And she was right about that. She also thought it would be bad for the Jews. I mean, she was actually arguing she thought it was going to be a catastrophe. She was wrong about that, or at least so far. We'll see what happens. Yeah, but I appreciate I thank you for.
I think one of the biggest dangers to the Jewish state is the Jewish antipathy towards it.
Okay, good. Let's use that as a good place to end then. We are now going to go on break until the new year. So I wish you all a very happy new year. I've heard from a lot of people and people want to keep reading this book. So I think what we're going to do is I'm going to select some essays out and we will keep reading. And the hope will be that we finish the book sometime. We start probably like second or third week in January after the new year. And we finish the book in something like end of February. And then my plan is that in March, April, and May, or maybe April and May, depending on when we finish this, we'll read a series of essays by Arendt on race. You know, it's something we've talked a lot about in this group the last few years. And, you know, it's something Jana and I are actually organizing a small event on Arendt and race for June. So it'll be a good opportunity for us to read this with you. I think it'll be an exciting set of essays to read. So we'll do that once we finish this book. We'll go from Jewish writings to her writings on race. And that will be, I hope, exciting for us. And then that will bring us to the summer, and then we'll see. And maybe we'll at some point start one of her big books again, either in the summer or in September. So that's my current plan on how we're going to go. Thank you all. Have a very, very happy holidays. And enjoy reading Hannah Arendt, and we'll see you. I'll post the schedule soon for the continued reading. It's not up yet, but it will be. Happy holidays, happy New Year, happy Hanukkah, Merry Christmas, whatever you're doing, celebrating, and I'll see you all in 2023. Thanks very much.